Integrity at the FBI is measured in seconds, and on the night of February 9th, it lasted exactly 74. The air in the Rayburn building felt thick with the institutional rot of 1,000 suppressed secrets. Representative Jasmine Crockett leaned over the mahogany bench, her eyes locked onto FBI Director Kash Patel with the intensity of a forensic surgeon about to make the first incision. The date was March 18, 2025, but the atmosphere was decades deep in systemic deception. Patel sat behind the witness table, a man sculpted from expensive wool and plausible deniability, his hand slowly descending after an oath that felt more like a suggestion than a sacred vow. The Oversight Committee room held its collective breath, a silence so brittle it threatened to shatter under the weight of the single manila folder resting before Crockett. Director Patel, can you confirm that the FBI maintains digital logs of all evidence access, or has the Bureau upgraded to a system of spontaneous amnesia? The sarcasm in Crockett's voice was a razor blade wrapped in silk. Patel offered a practiced hollow nod. Every access is time-stamped, Congresswoman. It is an immutable record. A flicker of a smile touched Crockett's lips, the kind of smile a predator wears when the prey finally steps into the light. Then let us discuss the miracle of February 9th, where 17 active investigations, cases involving the very soul of public corruption, decided to commit digital suicide between 11:47 and 11:48 p.m. She didn't wait for his rehearsed stutter. She slid the first document forward, a cold, hard printout of the Sentinel database that looked like a list of casualties from a bloodless war. 17 rows of administrative erasure, 17 investigations into the powerful and the protected, all marked with the same cryptic epitaph. Admin sealed, Dear Auth Req. The timestamps didn't just suggest a pattern, they screamed a conspiracy. Patel's hand froze near his glass of water, the condensation reflecting a man whose credentials had just been found at the scene of a digital crime. 74 seconds, Director. That is the time it takes to brew a mediocre cup of coffee. Yet, in that window, you managed to bury investigations that took years to build. Patel's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his skin like trapped animals. I would need to review the specific operational context. The context is sitting on your terminal, Director. Terminal ID DIR01 primary. Unless someone else has taken up residence in your office at midnight to perform administrative lobotomies on federal cases, this is your signature on the death warrants of justice. The room's temperature seemed to plummet as Crockett's clinical dissection continued. She produced the internal access logs for Terminal DIR01 primary, the digital heartbeat of the director's private suite. The document hit the table with a heavy thud, echoing like a gavel. This wasn't just a breach. It was an execution of due process carried out from the very seat of power. Photographers in the gallery shifted, their lenses focused on the tightening of Patel's knuckles. The director's defense was a masterclass in bureaucratic obfuscation. Administrative reclassifications occur for various operational reasons. Classification decisions are made in consultation with senior leadership. He spoke as if reading from a manual on how to say nothing with 1,000 words. Crockett cut through the fog. Yes or no, Director? Did you personally authorize the sealing of these 17 cases, or should we be looking for a ghost in the machine? Patel's eyes darted to his attorney, a brief, desperate communion before returning to the Congresswoman's unflinching gaze. I'd need to review the full context before— That is not a yes or no answer, Director. In the world of evidence, things either exist or they do not. Between 11:47 and 11:48 p.m., they cease to exist. She turned the page to Case CC 2025 1103. An investigation into the fraudulent appropriation of federal disaster relief funds. A case about stolen money meant for the desperate, now hidden by the powerful. 31 witnesses, 12 subpoenas, and a lead agent named Michael Torin who had the audacity to believe his work mattered. On February 8th, Agent Torin requested an expedited grand jury referral. He cited a time-sensitive evidentiary window. He was ignored. Crockett produced the email that acted as the digital muzzle. Sent from Kash Patel's private account at 6:14 p.m. Hold pending review. No external contact. What does no external contact mean in the context of a grand jury, Director? Is it the Bureau's new policy to shield suspects from the inconvenience of a trial? Patel remained stone-faced, his breathing shallow. It is standard protocol when cases require higher-level review. The review apparently involved locking the lead agent out of his own file. Crockett displayed a screen capture of Torin's failed login attempt from February 9th, 14 hours before the files were officially sealed. Access denied. Admin override. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The man who built the case was the only one forbidden from seeing it. Why was Agent Torin locked out of his investigation before you even sealed it, Director? Was he too close to a truth that didn't fit the Bureau's current narrative? Patel shifted, his chair creaking in the oppressive silence. I'd need to review the specific access protocols. You've been reviewing protocols for 10 minutes, Director, while justice has been under review for months. Then came the final blow for the morning session. The evidence discrepancy report filed by Torin on February 10th. Items EV11-3047 through EV103063, financial transaction records, encrypted communications, the very DNA of a corruption case, had not just been moved. They were gone, deleted, wiped from the face of the federal record. Director, 17 pieces of evidence vanished. The agent was silenced. The terminal was yours. Moved where? Crockett's voice was a low, dangerous hum. Patel's hands remained flat, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the room, perhaps looking for an exit that didn't exist. That information is classified. The gallery erupted, a tidal wave of murmurs and frantic typing. The chairman's gavel struck twice, a futile attempt to impose order on a collapsing reputation. Crockett didn't blink. She just pulled out a thicker folder. If the truth is classified, Director, then we shall have to declassify your silence. The second hour of the hearing didn't bring warmth. It brought a clinical, freezing clarity. Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't bother with a fresh glass of water. She didn't need it. Her focus remained on the man across from her, Director Kash Patel, who was now appearing less like a pillar of law enforcement and more like a crumbling monument to institutional secrecy. The silence that followed the mention of classified compartments was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a vault door closing. Crockett reached into her folder, her fingers grazing the edge of a document with a precision that suggested she knew exactly where the jugular was located. Let us pivot, Director, from the disaster funds you failed to protect to a more intimate matter. Case EC 2023-442. This wasn't a new investigation. It had been breathing, growing, and gathering teeth for 16 months. An obstruction investigation involving falsified records submitted to federal oversight bodies. Essentially, Director, a case about people in power lying to people like us. Crockett's voice carried a satirical edge that cut through the tension. 62 witness interviews, 84 subpoenaed documents. A mountain of evidence that suddenly became a molehill at 11:47 p.m. on February 9th. The same 74-second window. The same digital executioner at terminal DER01 primary. Patel's face remained a mask of stone, though a slight twitch in his jaw betrayed the effort it took to maintain it. Investigative priorities shift based on emerging threats, he offered, his voice a dry rasp. Crockett leaned in, her eyes narrowing. Is that what we call it now? A shifting priority? Because on February 8th, while your terminal was warming up for its midnight mass deletion, an assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District was actually trying to do her job. She requested a status update. She was preparing a prosecution memo. She thought she was about to hold someone accountable. She slid a new document toward him. It was an email from an FBI liaison, dated February 9th, 10:03 a.m. The message was as brief as a suicide note. Case EC 2023-442 is no longer active. Further inquiries should be directed to FBI Office of Public Affairs. Director, when a prosecutor is told to talk to a PR spokesperson instead of a lead agent, what is the operational necessity there? Is it because the evidence was so strong it became a liability? Patel didn't blink. I cannot comment on internal communications between the Bureau and the Department of Justice. You don't have to comment, Director. The email speaks for itself. It says, case closed. Not by a judge, not by a jury, but by a redirect to a press office. In the trade, we call that burying the body. The gallery, once a cacophony of whispers, had gone unnaturally still. The gravity of the implication that the FBI was actively sabotaging the DOJ's ability to prosecute corruption was sinking in. Crockett didn't give him room to breathe. She pulled out a fresh stack of paper, the ink still smelling of the printer. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to remember you are under oath, not under the protection of a secure compartment. Did you personally order the deletion of evidence from case CC 2025-11003? The director's attorney leaned in, a frantic whisper shielded by a hand. Patel shook his head, a microscopic movement. I did not delete evidence. Crockett's retort was instantaneous. Did you order someone else to delete it? I did not order evidence deletion. Then, where is it? The question hung in the air like a noose. Patel's hands pressed flat against the table, his knuckles white. Some materials are moved to secure compartments. Compartments that the case agent can't access, Crockett pressed. Correct. Compartments that a federal prosecutor can't access? In some circumstances, yes. Compartments that this committee can't access. Patel's jaw tightened until it looked like it might crack. Congressional oversight has established procedures for sensitive. Director, yes or no? Can you produce the missing evidence logs from case C-2025-11103 right now? I would need to consult with... Yes or no? Silence. Not the silence of a man who didn't know the answer, but the silence of a man who knew the answer was an admission of guilt. Crockett didn't wait for the lapse to end. She pulled out the heavy hitter, the subpoena. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a physical manifestation of the committee's losing patience. She didn't hand it to him. She placed it on the table between them like a challenge. This subpoena requires the production of all access logs, reclassification orders, and evidence custody records for all 17 cases. You have 7 days, Director. Not 7 days to review, not 7 days to consult. 7 days to deliver. Patel's eyes tracked the document. Some of that material is classified, he repeated, his only remaining shield. Then you will produce it in a classified setting. Crockett shot back. But let's be clear. These investigations aren't ongoing. You killed them. You can't claim an active investigation privilege for a corpse you helped bury. The director's attorney stood halfway up, then sat back down as Crockett continued her onslaught. We are also issuing subpoenas for your personal communications, emails, memos, text messages, from February 1st to February 15th. We want to see the architecture of the 74-second disappearance. And director? We're not just looking at the digital trail. We've invited Agent Michael Torin to join us, and the Assistant U.S. Attorney, and every single staffer who had the keys to Terminal DIR-01 Primary. She leaned back, her expression shifting from clinical to predatory. We are referring this matter to the Inspector General for investigation into potential evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. The chairman's gavel came down, but it felt like a period at the end of a death sentence. The witness is excused. Patel rose. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at the gallery. He kept his eyes fixed on the exit, moving with a controlled, robotic grace. But as he walked past the bench, he couldn't hide the fact that he was leaving the subpoena behind. Crockett watched him go, her manila folder still open. The 17 cases were still gone. The evidence was still missing. But for the first time in 74 seconds of digital darkness, there was a flickering light. The room emptied, the air slowly returning to its natural state. But the stain of the 74 seconds remained. In the quiet of the emptying chamber, the single manila folder on Crockett's desk seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. A reminder that while files can be deleted, the truth has a way of being recovered. The fluorescent lights of the Rayburn building corridors hummed with a low-frequency anxiety as the press corps swarmed Director Patel's retreating back. But while the flash bulbs popped in the hallway, the real tectonic shift was occurring in a windowless room 3 floors below the hearing chamber. Representative Jasmine Crockett did not join the victory lap on the cable news circuits. She understood that a subpoena was merely a piece of paper until it drew blood. She sat across from a man who looked like he hadn't slept since the 74-second digital purge began. Special Agent Michael Torin, the man whose career had been administratively sealed alongside his files, sat with his hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of government-issued coffee. The air in the room was sterile, smelling of industrial cleaner and the ozone of high-end encryption. Torin wasn't a man built for politics. He was built for the grind of forensic accounting. A man who lived in the margins of bank statements and encrypted metadata. They didn't just lock the door, Congresswoman, Torin began, his voice devoid of the theatricality found in the hearing room upstairs. They changed the locks, burned the building, and then tried to convince me the building never existed. Crockett didn't offer platitudes. She offered a digital tablet. Walk me through the override, Agent. The director claims operational necessity. I want to know what that necessity looks like on a server rack. Torin's fingers, stained with the yellow ink of highlighters, moved across the screen. Look at the entropy of the deletion. Normally, when you seal a case, the pointers remain. The file is moved to a secure partition, but the hash values, the digital fingerprints of the evidence, stay in the audit log. But on February 9th, at 11:47:43 p.m., something else happened. A deep scrub command was executed from DIR-01 Primary. It's a scorched earth protocol designed for compromised deep cover assets. You don't use it on a fraud case unless you want the evidence to stop existing in this dimension. The irony was not lost on Crockett. The FBI's most sophisticated tools for protecting the nation were being used as a high-tech shredder for political convenience. And the financial records in CC 2025-103? The ones regarding the disaster relief funds? Torin's expression soured. Those weren't just records. Those were the maps. We had traced the siphoned funds through 3 layers of shell companies. The final destination was a private equity firm with direct ties to, well, let's just say people who don't like being under a microscope. When I tried to access the forensic audit on the morning of the 10th, the system didn't just say, "Access denied." It told me the file ID was invalid. It was as if I was searching for a ghost. The satire of the situation was almost too heavy to bear. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, an agency defined by its memory, had suddenly developed a terminal case of Alzheimer's regarding its most sensitive corruption cases. "The Assistant U.S. Attorney," Crockett prompted. She was ready to move? She was 24 hours away from signing the prosecution memo, Torrin said, a bitter laugh escaping him. She had the wiretap transcripts. She had the bank's signatures. Then she gets an email telling her to talk to public affairs? That's not a legal directive. That's a gag order wrapped in a press release. Crockett leaned back, the shadows of the room carving deep lines into her face. Patel claimed the evidence was moved to secure compartments. "If I find these compartments, Agent, what will I find?" Torrin looked her directly in the eye, the fatigue momentarily replaced by a cold, hard clarity. "You won't find folders, Congresswoman. You'll find a vacuum. If they used the credentials from DIR-01, they didn't move the evidence to a secure room. They moved it to a black hole, a part of the server that is exempt from standard judicial discovery. It's where the Bureau hides its sins under the guise of national security." The drama of the moment wasn't in a loud outburst, but in the realization of the scale of the subversion. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a glitch. It was a 74-second coup against the rule of law, executed with a few keystrokes by a man who had sworn to uphold it. Outside, the sun was setting over the Capitol, but inside the windowless room, the darkness was just beginning to take shape. Crockett tapped a pen against the subpoena she still held. 7 days, she whispered. He thinks he can scrub the logs in 7 days. He can't, Torrin replied, a small, dangerous smile touching his lips, because he forgot about the Miami backup. We're old school in the field offices, Congresswoman. We don't trust the cloud when it's controlled by the weather in D.C. The game had changed. The 17 cases weren't just gone. They were bait. And the man who thought he had deleted the truth was about to find out that in the digital age, nothing is ever truly forgotten. The concept of a backup in the modern intelligence community is often a polite euphemism for insurance. As the clock began its relentless march toward the 7-day subpoena deadline, the atmosphere within the FBI's Hoover building shifted from professional arrogance to a frantic, quiet panic. Director Kash Patel was no longer just a witness. He was a man standing on a digital trapdoor, unaware that the mechanism was being greased from the outside. While the director's legal team spent the next 48 hours drafting letters of objection that read like bad existential poetry, Special Agent Michael Torrin was explaining the geography of the Miami shadow server to Jasmine Crockett's lead investigators. The room was different now, a SCIF, sensitive compartmented information facility, where the walls were literally lined with copper to prevent electronic eavesdropping. The Miami backup was not an official bureau policy. It was a survival instinct born from decades of watching justice die in the bureaucratic hallways of Washington. Torrin explained with a grim sort of satisfaction that the Miami field office operated on a legacy mirroring system for high-profile financial fraud. Every time a piece of evidence was uploaded to the Central Sentinel database in D.C., a ghost copy was pushed to a localized, offline storage array in Florida. It was a redundant failsafe designed for hurricanes, but it was about to become a Category 5 storm for the director. The 74-second purge hit the central node, Torin whispered, his eyes reflecting the blue light of a terminal. Patel's credentials allowed him to wipe the primary records and the secondary logs in D.C. He thought he was clearing the table. But the Miami Mirror disconnected 40 seconds into his little spree. The system saw the mass deletion as a catastrophic server failure, a digital heart attack, and it triggered an automatic air gap isolation. It went dark to save itself. Crockett, standing at the back of the room with her arms crossed, didn't smile. She practiced a form of political chess where smiles were reserved for the checkmate. So, you're telling me that while the director is claiming the evidence is moved or classified, the original unscrubbed data is sitting on a hard drive in a basement in Miami? Not just the data, Congresswoman, Torin replied. The metadata, the original unedited chain of custody. It shows exactly who initiated the deep scrub, and, more importantly, it contains the ghost logs, the files that show what was being deleted while the deletion was happening. It's the black box from the plane crash. The drama intensified as the political machinery began to grind. Back at the Bureau, the Office of Professional Responsibility was suddenly very interested in Agent Torin's travel records. They weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a way to discredit the messenger. By the third day after the hearing, a series of strategic leaks began to appear in the press, suggesting that Agent Torin was a disgruntled employee with a history of procedural irregularities. The satire was almost too heavy-handed. The very organization that had just lost 17 federal investigations was now lecturing the public on procedural integrity. Patel himself remained in a state of high-altitude denial. He was seen leaving the White House on the evening of the fourth day, his face a mask of calm that didn't quite reach his eyes. His strategy was simple: run out the clock. If he could hold the subpoena at bay for 7 days, he could claim executive privilege, bury the request in the courts for 6 months, and wait for the news cycle to move on to the next disaster. But Crockett was already 3 moves ahead. She didn't wait for the 7th day. On the morning of the 5th day, she sent a congressional staffer, not to the FBI headquarters, but to a nondescript federal warehouse in Miami. With her was a sergeant-at-arms and a forensic team from the GAO, Government Accountability Office. They didn't ask for permission. They presented a secondary, specific subpoena for the localized backup servers. The confrontation at the Miami facility was a masterpiece of political theater. The local FBI special agent in charge, a man who had served under 3 directors and trusted none of them, looked at the congressional order, looked at the black-suited men from D.C. who were trying to block the entrance, and made a choice. He stepped aside. The director says those files don't exist, the Miami agent in charge told the congressional team as he swiped his keycard. So, I suppose he won't mind if you take these empty servers back to Washington. Back in D.C., the news of the Miami seizure hit Patel's office like a physical blow. The 74-second disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was a countdown. The evidence, the transaction records, the wiretaps, the smoking gun memos, was currently in a secure transport vehicle, flying toward Dulles International Airport. Crockett sat in her office that night, watching the lights of the Capitol. She had the logs. She had the whistleblower. And now, she had the digital corpses that Patel had tried to cremate. The administrative darkness was about to be hit with the blinding light of a forensic audit. 7 days was too generous, she remarked to her chief of staff, her voice as cold as the marble floors of the Rayburn building. He only needed 74 seconds to commit the crime. It's only fair we give him the same amount of time to realize he's caught. The hearing room on day 6 was no longer a stage for political theater. It had become a digital morgue. The air conditioning hummed at a frantic pitch, struggling to cool the array of forensic servers that now occupied the space once reserved for the director's legal team. At the center of the room sat the Miami Mirror, a black, industrial-grade server rack that held the unvarnished truth of the 74-second purge. Representative Jasmine Crockett did not start with a question. She started with a display. Behind her, the massive high-definition screens that usually showed maps of voting districts now flickered to life with a scrolling wall of green text. It was the raw, unencrypted metadata from the Miami backup. Director Patel, you previously stated that these 17 cases were moved to secure compartments for operational necessity. Crockett's voice was a rhythmic hammer. Her eyes didn't even flicker toward the director, who sat at the witness table looking significantly more haggard than he had 48 hours prior. We have successfully bypassed the administrative seal using the localized Miami logs. It turns out, Director, that when you delete a file in D.C., the echo in Miami doesn't just record the disappearance, it records the content. She tapped a button on her tablet. The screen froze on case EC 2023-442, the obstruction investigation that had been buried alive. The public affairs redirect was gone, replaced by the original high-level prosecution memo that the assistant U.S. attorney had been forbidden from filing. Let's talk about the names in this file, Director. The names you didn't want the grand jury to see at 11:47 p.m. on February 9th. Crockett began to read, her voice clinical and cold. The list included 3 sitting board members of a multi-billion-dollar federal contractor and a high-ranking official within the Department of the Treasury. These weren't just procedural irregularities. These were targets in a criminal conspiracy involving the falsification of environmental safety records for a deep-water drilling project. The satire of the Bureau's defense was now undeniable. The FBI hadn't been protecting national security. It had been acting as a high-end concierge service for the politically connected. Patel's attorney attempted to interject, his voice cracking. This data is unverified. It was obtained through a congressional subpoena of a federal facility. Counsel, sit down.
Crockett didn't even look up from her notes. Director Patel, look at the screen. She pointed to a specific line of code. Exec command, delete Beth Books, auth, dir01 primary. Do you know what happens when you use a delete #null command? It doesn't just hide the file, it attempts to rewrite the history of the server so that the file never occupied that space. It is a tool for spies, not for investigators. Why did you use a digital assassination tool on an active corruption case? Patel's hands were no longer flat on the table. He was twisting a gold signet ring on his pinky finger, a telltale sign of a man searching for a script that had been burned. As I've stated, I'd need to review the... You have reviewed the protocols for 6 days, Director.
Crockett finally snapped, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. The evidence is right there. It shows that while you were telling the world the FBI was working for the American people, you were personally presiding over the digital cremation of a case that would have put your biggest donors in federal prison. The drama reached a crescendo as Crockett revealed the smoking gun within the Miami backup. It wasn't just the evidence, it was a series of encrypted pings sent from terminal dir01 primary to an external, non-government IP address during those 74 seconds. You weren't just deleting files, Director. You were notifying someone that the job was done. You were sending a clear signal to an external party. Who was on the other end of that IP address? Silence. The same thick, suffocating silence from day one. But this time, it didn't feel like a tactical retreat. It felt like the end of the road. Crockett leaned back, her face a mask of weary triumph. On February 9th, You thought you were the master of the machine. You thought 74 seconds was enough to make the truth disappear forever. But you forgot that the Bureau is made of more than just servers. It's made of people like Agent Torin, who remember their oaths even when their directors forget theirs. She closed the manila folder. It was no longer the only document on the table. It was surrounded by a mountain of recovered truth. Director, the Inspector General has been granted full access to the Miami Mirror. By tomorrow morning, the names we've discussed today will be in the hands of a special prosecutor who doesn't report to you. The chairman's gavel didn't just excuse the witness, it sounded like a closing door. Patel stood up, but for the first time, he didn't look controlled. He looked small. He looked like a man who had tried to play God with a hard drive and realized he was only a ghost in the machine. As the cameras followed him out, the green text on the screens behind Crockett continued to scroll. A digital waterfall of everything Patel had tried to kill, now very much alive. The revelation of the external IP address transformed the investigation from a case of internal FBI misconduct into a full-blown constitutional crisis. By the afternoon of March 20th, the 74-second disappearance was no longer just about what had been deleted, but who had been watching the deletion in real time. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat in the high-security briefing room of the House Oversight Committee, her face illuminated by the harsh white glow of a forensic map. Beside her, technical analysts from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, worked in tandem with Agent Torin to trace the digital breadcrumbs left by the director's signal. The trace did not lead to a foreign adversary or a rogue hacker collective. It led to a nondescript office building in Arlington, Virginia, the headquarters of Aegis Strategic Holdings, a private intelligence firm staffed almost entirely by former Bureau high-rankers. "The satire writes itself," Crockett remarked, tapping a rhythmic beat against the table. The FBI director deletes federal evidence and pings a private firm to let them know the coast is clear. It's not just obstruction. It's a subscription-based justice system. The kitchen shifted from the hearing room to the digital battlefield. The forensic map showed a direct encrypted tunnel, a backdoor, that had been established between Terminal DIR-1 Primary and Aegis Strategic months before the February 9th purge. This wasn't a one-time breach. It was a permanent tap. "Look at the traffic volume, Congresswoman," Torin said, pointing to a spike in the data flow. Every time Agent Torin, or anyone in the field, uploaded a document to the 17 flagged cases, a copy was immediately mirrored to Aegis. They knew what we had before we even had a chance to analyze it. When the director hit the deep scrub button, he wasn't just clearing the FBI's servers. He was fulfilling a contract. The narrative of operational necessity that Patel had clung to during the hearing began to dissolve into something far more sinister. The 17 cases were not random. They were the specific investigations that threatened the diverse interests of Aegis Strategic's client list. A list that included the same multi-billion-dollar contractors and Treasury officials Crockett had named on Day 6. Back at the FBI, the atmosphere had turned toxic. Staffers who had once looked at Patel with a mix of fear and respect now avoided his office as if it were a crime scene, which, in a very literal sense, it was. The director's suite was now cordoned off by the Inspector General's team, the golden seal on the door ironically framed by yellow evidence tape. Crockett didn't wait for the next scheduled session. She launched a Twitter thread offensive that bypassed the traditional media gatekeepers, posting the redacted logs of the Aegis pings. The public reaction was a volatile mix of outrage and dark humor. The hashtag #74seconds became a symbol of systemic rot, with citizens posting photos of what they could accomplish in that time. usually something significantly less destructive than erasing a federal corruption case. By evening, the committee issued a second wave of subpoenas, these ones targeting the executives at Aegis Strategic Holdings. But as the process servers arrived at the Arlington office, they found a scene that mirrored the digital purge of February 9th. Paper shredders were humming, hard drives were being degaussed, the architects of the void were trying to disappear along with their data. "They're running," Crockett told her team, watching the live feed of the raid. "But you can't shred a digital echo." The satire reached its peak when Patel's own attorney attempted to file a motion to suppress the Aegis evidence, claiming that the privacy rights of the private firm had been violated by the congressional trace. Crockett's response was a single-sentence press release. "The Bureau's privacy ends where the public's betrayal begins." As Part 6 drew to a close, the investigation had moved beyond the 74 seconds. It was now exploring the months of the TAP, the period where the FBI had been turned into an outsourced research wing for the very people it was supposed to be investigating. The administrative darkness was expanding, but the light Crockett was shining was starting to burn the hands of those who held the switches. The final image of the day was of a single black SUV leaving the Aegis parking lot, pursued by a swarm of reporters. Inside, the documents that didn't get shredded held the key to case CC 2025 03. The disaster relief funds hadn't just been stolen. They had been used to fund the very secure compartments Patel had used to hide his tracks. The seventh day arrived not with a whimper of legal compliance, but with the roar of a dam finally bursting. While the FBI director's legal team was busy filing injunctions against the unlawful seizure of the Miami Mirror, the walls of the Eastern District were beginning to talk. The assistant U.S. attorney, who had been told to talk to public affairs, Sarah Jenkins, had finally decided that her oath of office outweighed her fear of career suicide. The setting for this confrontation was not the grand stage of the Oversight Committee, but a small, sterile deposition room. Sarah Jenkins sat under the harsh glare of LED lights, her eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and cold fury. Behind her was a mountain of boxes, physical evidence that had survived the digital purge simply because it had been printed out before February 9th. "They thought they could delete the DNA of the case," Jenkins began, her voice a low, steady tremor. "But they forgot that a prosecution memo is more than just bits and bytes. It's a narrative, and I had already sent that narrative to 3 different secure servers before Patel's terminal ever woke up." Crockett, appearing via video link, didn't waste a second on formalities. "AUSA Jenkins, tell the committee about the master key. We found references to it in the Aegis raid. What was the bridge between your evidence and the director's office?" Jenkins pulled a document from the top box. It was a conflict of interest waiver that had been buried in the Bureau's administrative archives. The bridge was the money. Case CC 2025-1103 wasn't just about disaster relief fraud. It was about how that fraud was used to pay for the shadow budget of the FBI's new digital surveillance wing, a wing that was operated, coincidentally, by Aegis Strategic Holdings. The satire was now a biting indictment. The FBI was investigating a theft, only to find out the stolen money was being used to pay the people who were helping the FBI investigate the theft. It was a closed loop of corruption, a bureaucratic Ouroboros devouring its own tail. "On February 8th, Jenkins continued, I informed the Bureau liaison that I was ready to name names. I had the bank records linking Aegis executives to the shell companies in the Cayman Islands. By 6:20 p.m., I was told to hold for review. By 11:47 p.m. the next night, my entire digital case file had been turned into a null directory. The Keachtin reached a fever pitch as Jenkins revealed the contents of a private recording she had made during a phone call with Director Patel's Chief of Staff. In the recording, the voice of the Chief of Staff was clear. "Sarah, you need to understand the optics. We can't have the Bureau's primary tech partner being indicted in an election year. This isn't a legal decision. It's a structural one." "A structural decision," Crockett repeated, the words dripping with sarcasm. "Is that the new term for obstruction of justice? Because it sounds like you were being told that the law is only applicable if it doesn't interfere with the Bureau's vendor relationships." Jenkins nodded slowly. "I was told that if I proceeded, the evidence would fail to materialize in court. I didn't realize they meant they would literally delete it from the universe." The deposition room fell silent as the weight of the testimony sank in. This wasn't just about one man, Kash Patel, or 74 seconds of deleted logs. It was about an agency that had become so entwined with private interests that it could no longer distinguish between protecting the country and protecting its contractors. Back in the Rayburn building, the news of Jenkins's testimony hit like a shockwave. The administrative darkness was being flooded with the light of 1,000 bank statements. Crockett's team had already begun cross-referencing the Aegis master key with the recovered Miami files. The results were devastating. Every one of the 17 cases involved a client or an affiliate of Aegis Strategic. The 74-second disappearance was the final act of a long-running play. Patel hadn't just deleted the files to hide a crime, he had deleted them to hide a partnership. Crockett looked at the camera, her face a mask of resolute iron. Director Patel thought he could hide behind classified compartments and operational necessity. But Sarah Jenkins just handed us the map to the vault. And we're not just going to open it, we're going to tear the door off the hinges. The final 7 hours of the subpoena deadline did not expire in a courtroom. They bled out in a high-stakes blockade at the gates of the J. Edgar Hoover building. By 2:00 p.m. on March 25th, the satire of cooperation had vanished. Director Kash Patel had retreated into his top-floor suite, flanked by a dwindling circle of loyalists and a phalanx of bureau lawyers who were now arguing that the building itself was a privileged site, exempt from congressional entry. Representative Jasmine Crockett was not waiting for a courier. She arrived at the FBI's main entrance in a black SUV flanked by the House Sergeant-at-Arms and a team of forensic auditors from the Department of Justice's Office of the Inspector General, OIG. The cameras, perched like vultures across the street, captured the moment the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world refused entry to its own oversight body. "The director is in a classified briefing," a stone-faced security officer stated, his hand resting uncomfortably near his holster. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She simply held up the updated warrant, signed by a federal judge 3 hours prior, authorizing the immediate seizure of Terminal DIR-01 primary. "The director is in a crime scene," she corrected, "and every minute you stand there, you are transitioning from a federal officer to an accessory after the fact. Move!" The drama of the standoff was broadcast live to a nation that had become obsessed with the numbered 74-second saga. Inside the building, the tension was a physical weight. Sources within the Bureau began leaking reports of a digital civil war breaking out between the IT division, who were being ordered to wipe the internal servers one last time, and the field agents who had formed a human chain around the server room to prevent it. The irony was peak bureaucracy. The FBI was currently under siege by the FBI. While the standoff at the gate continued, Agent Michael Torin was in a secure van parked 3 blocks away, using the Miami master key to monitor the internal network. "They're trying to initiate a Level 4 wipe," Torin told Crockett over an encrypted earpiece. "If they finish that, the metadata we recovered in Miami won't matter, Because the DC hub will send a poison pill packet that corrupts the entire mirrored chain. They're trying to kill the evidence's future, not just its past. Crockett turned to the sergeant-at-arms. Break the seal. The entrance wasn't breached with a battering ram, but with a legal ultimatum. The OIG officials bypassed the security desk, using their superior jurisdictional authority to override the director's lockdown. As Crockett marched through the vaulted lobby, the silence of the staffers was haunting. These were people trained to hunt shadows, now watching the shadow of their own leadership being dragged into the light. When they reached the director's suite, the door was locked. No answer to the rapping of the sergeant-at-arms. "Director Patel?" Crockett called out, her voice echoing off the mahogany panels. "7 days ago, I told you that the truth has a way of being recovered. Right now, your IT department is refusing your orders to wipe the servers. Your secure compartments are being opened in Miami. The only thing left to decide is if you walk out of this office as a witness or a defendant." Silence. Then, the distinct mechanical click of a heavy deadbolt sliding back. The door opened to reveal a room that looked like a war zone of paper and panic. Kash Patel stood behind his desk, the immutable terminal DIR01 primary glowing a ghostly blue behind him. He looked like a man who had tried to outrun a digital avalanche and finally ran out of breath. "The servers are down," Patel said, his voice a hollow shell of the one he had used in the hearing. "An external interference. We've lost connectivity." "That's not interference, Director," Crockett said, stepping into the room and placing her manila folder on his desk for the final time. "That's called a court order. We disconnected your terminal 10 minutes ago from the Miami hub. You're not in control of the 74 seconds anymore. We are." The satire reached its inevitable conclusion as the OIG auditors began bagging the director's personal devices. The man who had used the most sophisticated technology on Earth to hide 17 cases was being undone by a simple physical disconnect. As Patel was escorted from the room, not in handcuffs, but in a state of profound institutional isolation, he passed Agent Torin in the hallway. No words were exchanged. The man who followed the rules looked at the man who rewrote them. And for the first time since February 9th, the power dynamic was restored. The 74 seconds were over. The investigation into the investigators was just beginning. While the physical halls of the FBI were being reclaimed by the Inspector General, a silent, invisible war was still raging within the circuitry of the Bureau's mainframe. The poison pill packet, a scorched earth code sequence Agent Torin had detected, wasn't just designed to delete files. It was a digital suicide note intended to corrupt the very architecture of the Miami backup. Representative Jasmine Crockett stood in the FBI's primary cyber command center, a room that looked like the bridge of a starship, now occupied by a joint task force of GAO auditors and rebel bureau coders. The satire of the moment was palpable. The government was currently hacking itself to prevent its own leadership from committing a digital felony. "The packet is encrypted with a rolling 200-bit key," Torin explained, his eyes bloodshot as he tracked the pulsing red line on the monitor. "It was triggered at the exact moment the sergeant-at-arms breached the director's suite. It's a dead man's switch. If we don't isolate the header, it will flood the Miami mirror with noise, random data that will overwrite the recovered 17 cases permanently." Crockett watched the screen with the intensity of a general. "How long, Agent?" 80 seconds, Torin replied. 20 more than the original purge lasted. The Keech tin of the countdown was a mirror image of the February 9th disappearance. But this time, the 74 seconds were working in favor of the truth. As the task force successfully quarantined the malicious code, a final, hidden layer of the Sentinel database began to decompress. This was the vault within the vault, the directory where the most sensitive metadata was stored, a place even the director's primary credentials shouldn't have been able to reach without a secondary authorization. "Wait," a technician whispered, the room falling into a sudden vacuum-like silence. The deep scrub command from February 9th. It wasn't just authorized by DIR-01 primary. Crockett leaned in. "Explain." "The system requires a dual-key authentication for a Level 4 wipe. Patel provided the first key. But the second key, it didn't come from inside the building." The revelation hit the room like a physical shock. The satire of internal corruption was gone, replaced by a darker reality. The second key had been issued by an external super user account, a credential that shouldn't exist in a secure federal system. "Trace the super user," Crockett ordered, her voice a low, dangerous hum. As the decryption software peeled back the layers of the external signal, the name associated with the second key began to form on the screen. It wasn't an Aegis executive. It wasn't a Treasury official. It was a name that had been conspicuously absent from the entire hearing, a name that sat at the very apex of the federal hierarchy. The final name on the 17-case deletion list wasn't a target of an investigation. It was the reason for the deletion. Case CC 2025-1103, the disaster relief fraud, had a hidden subfile titled Project Horizon. Inside that file were the private financial records of the sitting Attorney General's family-owned conglomerate. The 74-second purge wasn't just Patel protecting his donors. It was a desperate, coordinated effort to shield the man who sat directly above him in the Department of Justice. "So, the director wasn't the architect," Crockett said, a grim smile touching her lips. "He was just the contractor. The order came from the penthouse." The drama of the discovery was interrupted by a notification on the main screen. The poison pill had been neutralized, but not before it managed to send one final ping to an address in Georgetown. "They know we have it," Torrens said. Crockett didn't blink. She turned to the OIG investigators. "The director is already in custody for questioning. Now, I want a warrant for the Attorney General's private server, and I want it before the sun comes up." The satire reached its ultimate peak when the Department of Justice's own website briefly went offline, replaced by a scheduled maintenance screen. The administrative darkness was no longer a metaphor. It was a literal attempt by the highest legal office in the land to turn off the lights before the police arrived. But the 17 ghosts were already out of the machine. The names were recorded. The transaction hashes were verified. And in the 74 seconds it took for the news to hit the wires, the power structure of Washington began to liquefy. The final movement of the 74-second symphony did not conclude with a gavel, but with the rhythmic, mechanical hum of a high-speed printer in the House Oversight Committee's inner sanctum. It was 4:00 a.m. on March 26, 2025. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat at the head of a table strewn with the Project Horizon files, the skeletal remains of a conspiracy that had tried to delete its own shadow. The satire of the director's suite was now complete. The man who had once held the keys to the kingdom, Kash Patel, was currently being debriefed in a secure facility, his classified shields having evaporated the moment the dual-key authentication was traced back to the Attorney General's private IP. The hunter had become the primary evidence. "Look at the final transaction, Congresswoman," Agent Torrens said, pointing to a recovered ledger from the Miami Mirror. The disaster relief funds weren't just laundered. They were used to purchase the very encryption software the Bureau used for the deep scrub. They used the taxpayers' stolen money to buy the silencer for the gun they used to kill the investigation. The Kichtin reached its absolute peak as the sun began to rise over the Capitol, casting long, needle-like shadows across the mall. Crockett walked back into the hearing room, the same room where, just days ago, Patel had sat in arrogant silence. This time, the witness chair was empty, but the table was piled high with 17 thick blue-bound volumes, one for every investigation that had disappeared. The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of a completed circuit. On February 9, 2025, at 11:47 p.m., the lights went out on 17 federal investigations, Crockett began, speaking directly into the primary camera lens for the history books. We were told it was an operational necessity. We were told the records were immutably lost. We were told that the director's terminal was a black box that no one could peer inside. She picked up a single sheet of paper, the final recovered log. But 74 seconds is a long time in the digital age. It is enough time to commit a crime, yes, but it is also enough time to create an echo. The Project Horizon files proved that the Bureau wasn't protecting the state. It was protecting a syndicate. The Attorney General, the Director of the FBI, and the executives at Aegis Strategic didn't just delete files, they tried to delete the concept of the law. The fallout was instantaneous. As Crockett released the Horizon Ledger to the public, the resignation of the Attorney General was announced via a short, panicked-typed memo. The superuser had been unmasked, and with him, the entire architecture of the 74-second purge collapsed. The satire reached its ultimate, biting conclusion in the final minutes of the session. The very system Patel had used to lock out Agent Torin was now being used to lock Patel out of his own pension and legal defense funds, as the OIG invoked the Evidence Tampering Act to freeze his assets. Director Patel asked for context, Crockett said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a shout. Here is the context. 17 cases have been reopened. 17 grand juries are being empaneled. And the 74 seconds that were meant to be the Bureau's darkest hour have become the brightest light we've ever shown on this building. Agent Torin stood in the back of the room, his badge restored, watching as the forensic teams began the long process of reintegrating the Miami data into the main servers. He looked at his watch. 11:47 p.m. was just a time on a clock again, not a funeral for justice. Crockett gathered her manila folder, the original one from the first day. She didn't close it this time. She handed it to the new acting director, a career officer who had stood with Torin in the server room. "Don't lose them again," she said. The cameras stayed rolling as the room emptied. The 74-second disappearance had failed. Not because the technology was flawed, but because the human element, the whistle in the dark, couldn't be digitized or deleted. The investigations into fraud, corruption, and obstruction were no longer in administrative darkness. They were on the front page of every newspaper in the world. And somewhere in a secure holding cell, Kash Patel finally understood the one thing his terminal couldn't tell him. You can delete the file, but you can never delete the truth.